Hey nerds. So, going to continue my series here on the future of religion by Gianni Vattimo and Richard Rorty, who are Richard Rorty. I would say he's my favorite pragmatist, and he's like a pragmatist atheist, I would say, but a soft atheist, and he doesn't have a problem with religion. And Gianni Vattimo is a Catholic philosopher, and so remember, what's interesting about this book to me is that basically one of their most interesting points and kind of seemingly one of the main theses of their book is that with Nietzsche's death of God, not meaning the literal death of God, of course, meaning the secularization of culture during the Enlightenment, it replaced God as being like the main aspect of culture that everyone focuses on, that is embedded into the institutions of science, religion, and government. And so basically they say that the death of God opened up the door for a religion without a metaphysical God. Like this idea of a personal God that you don't have to actually justify or provide proof for existing, because it doesn't matter. What you should just go with what you believe. And that's why I kind of like Richard Rorty's approach to, if you ask him the question, does God exist? He says, I don't care. So, but anyway, in this paragraph, they're getting into some complex stuff involving hermeneutics, Christianity, metaphysics, and we're getting a little bit into Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Hegel and Descartes. So basically, remember, metaphysics is kind of like the study of the structure and function of the universe. It sometimes involves God, sometimes it does involve God, and it's just basically like how reality works, how it was started, the Big Bang, whether there is a God, whether there needs to be a first cause. If there is a God, what created the God? If there is a Big Bang, was that the only one? Etc. So, and of course, if we're talking about Descartes, the Cartesian means to do with Descartes, of course. So basically, this idea of like foundationalist rationalism, which I think is fundamentally flawed, because it relies on the idea that it relies on an a priori, what Kant would call it, synthetic a priori claim, meaning that you assume that it doesn't have to be justified at all. It's just assumed to be true, and you don't have to explain why it's true. So that's just a logical flaw, and it's supposed to be rationalism, and rationalism and logic aren't all they're cracked out to be. But if you're basing your philosophy on that, then that's just a fundamental flaw in your philosophy, in my opinion. And we get into Nietzsche and Heidegger in terms of physics and language and culture and relation between metaphysics and the logos. Of course, Jordan Peterson is just endlessly obsessed with the logos. He thinks this word of God and this idea of God being truth, that sort of thing, he's just obsessed with that and never shuts up about it, even though his view of Christianity is really antiquated and oversimplified. But anyway, so with all that in mind here, let's get into the paragraph. Okay, so this is the guy that's interviewing both Rorty and Gianni Vattimo in the book. Okay, so who he is isn't really important. Santiago Isabella. Okay, so he says, so this video is basically going to be me just explaining the question that he asked Richard Rorty, because it's such a complex question. All right, so before discussing the future of religion, I would like to talk about weak thought and its post-metaphysical culture. So you could say, like, based on the way I describe it, you could talk about post-metaphysical cultures, like a post-metaphysical religion, basically like a post-metaphysical Christianity, some sort of version of that is basically what Richard Rorty and Gianni Vattimo are advocating for in the book. And we'll get into what they talk about in their distinction between metaphysics and weak thought. Okay, so would like to talk about weak thought and its post-metaphysical culture. What you both have been working on was the paradigm shift from metaphysics to quote-unquote weak thought, which today is best represented by pragmatism and hermeneutics. So again, remember, pragmatism is, like, to oversimplify, basically this idea that what is true is what is most pragmatic. The definition varies depending on the pragmatist. Charles Peirce was one of the founders. William James is more religious, way more of a religious Christian than Rorty. But again, like, Rorty wasn't a militant atheist like Sam Harris. He saw that there were some advantages and disadvantages to religion and Christianity and other religions, which are interesting because you can justify those opinions in complex and fascinating ways from arguments like Hegel and Heidegger, right? If we're talking about metaphysics and being with a capital B in terms of what Heidegger is talking about. All right, so what you both have been working on was the paradigm shift from metaphysics to weak thought, which today is best represented by pragmatism and hermeneutics. So if we're talking about hermeneutics, that's basically, to oversimplify, interpretation. It's often biblical. It's interpretation of text. It's often biblical interpretation or some sort of theological interpretation, but it doesn't have to be that. Hermeneutics can be about anything. It can be like the premises of logic or culture or language. It's basically just interpretation, right? So if we're talking about pragmatism and hermeneutics, you could say pragmatic hermeneutics, if you could call it that, is this idea that the correct interpretation is what is the most pragmatic for the given time. Like, this is like basically the interpretation, your interpretation of a God is whatever works for you. It doesn't have to be a metaphysical God. It's whatever version of God you have in your head that is most pragmatic for you, that you want to believe in, and who fucking cares what others believe in. You don't have to believe in their God. They don't have to believe in your God or lack of God. Who gives a shit? That's why I like Rorty's approach in particular, but also the main point of this book, right? Main thesis of this book, I would say, or at least one of the main ones. All right, so paradigm shift from metaphysics to weak thought, which today is best represented by pragmatism and hermeneutics. The metaphysical tradition was dominated by the thought that there's something non-human that human beings should try to live up to, like enlightenment or transcendence. Like, we should try to live up to that, like this idea of living up to the transcendent God in the tradition of ancient Greek philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, right? So the thought that there's something non-human that human beings should try to live up to, and a key aspect of metaphysics, at least like classic metaphysics. So a thought that today finds its most plausible expression in the scientistic conception of culture. So scientistic meaning scientism, not scientific, meaning like basically ideology based on science. This idea that militant atheists like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins have, which is just as ideological religion, which is that science can provide you the answer to literally every question in life, and everything can be reduced to science, rationalism, and logic. And of course, for example, Sam Harris obviously wrote this entire dumb book called The Moral Landscape, in which he says that science can give us objective moral principles, which is obviously stupid on the face of it, because your moral principles are not based on science. They're based on culture, your upbringing, your rational thought and analysis. A lot of our moral compasses are just evolved. Like, we have an evolved sense of right or wrong. It may vary, but you don't have to, like, as Sam Harris would say, you don't need religion to have a moral compass, but it's also equally stupid to base your moral compass on science, unless you have this idea, this like stupid, antiquated, baited version of Christianity. But anyway, ideology is like cultish behavior like that is generally bad. Ideology isn't necessarily bad, but cultish behavior is. So anyway, James and Dewey, those are two other main pragmatists. William James I mentioned, and John Dewey, he kind of was more of a, I would say he was more of a political pragmatist, more specifically focused on like politics and education, that sort of thing. So James and Dewey stand with Nietzsche and Heidegger in asking us to abandon this tradition and culture. So abandon the metaphysical and scientific conception of culture. So Nietzsche and Heidegger, contrary to popular belief, like I said, Nietzsche was basically a militant atheist, but his view on religion was a lot more complex than a lot of people say it is. So actually, Nietzsche and Heidegger disagreed on a lot of issues, but they actually had a lot of agreement on their criticism. Well, Nietzsche and Heidegger agreed less about their criticisms of metaphysics, although they did have similar criticisms. But Heidegger was much more metaphysics, although he did say that his idea of capital B being was not supposed to be metaphysical. But they also were extremely critical of science, and even Nietzsche more so in particular. He kind of was more critical of science and religion than Heidegger, and he saw like this idea of objective truth as kind of like cultish behavior, just the same way as like extreme fundamentalist religion is cultish behavior, right? Okay, so James and Dewey stand with Nietzsche and Heidegger in asking us to abandon this tradition culture, the scientific and metaphysical culture. So even if Cartesian meaning to do with Descartes, basically. So Cartesian and Hegelian thought, you could say, like, to oversimplify, Cartesian thought could be rationalism, and Hegelian thought could be, I don't know, it's hard to describe, like some sort of complex metaphysical religion. Oh, so I guess you could say that you could connect Cartesian and Hegelian thought to science and metaphysics, basically. So James and Dewey, pragmatists, Nietzsche and Heidegger, you could loosely say they're existentialists. So pragmatists and existentialists want us to abandon metaphysical and scientific culture. But even if, let's say, rationalism and metaphysics has completed its parabola, I like that word, and the linguistic turn in philosophy, like, this idea that people talk about, that the like you could say attached to hermeneutics, our interpretations of things became more based on the language in a particular culture, in a particular geographic location at the particular time in which you live, right? Okay, so even if, let's say, Cartesian and Hegelian thought, or rationalism and scientism, has completed its parabola and the linguistic turn of philosophy has led us away from epistemology and metaphysics, epistemology loosely meaning knowledge. So the linguistic turn in philosophy has led us away from epistemology and metaphysics, or knowledge and metaphysics. It seems impossible to cut oneself off completely from the metaphysical logos. So basically, they're saying that Rorty and Vattimo, actually not Rorty and Vattimo, the guy who's asking the question is asking based on Rorty and Vattimo's thesis in this book, that you can get rid of this notion of the metaphysical God, that Nietzsche's Death of God opens up the door for a religion without a metaphysical God. They say that you can get rid of the metaphysical God, but never can escape completely from the metaphysical logos, or the metaphysical word of God. And you could say that's in connection to language. So you can escape the idea of the metaphysical God, but you can't escape the language of God in our culture, which makes sense, right? That's totally true. People say, oh my God, goddamn, that sort of shit. People don't mean it literally. Like most secular people use that language too. They don't mean it literally or religiously, right? So that's a good point. Even if you get rid of the idea of a metaphysical God, maybe the language of metaphysics and science stick in our culture. Definitely the language of science, much more than before, after the Enlightenment, right? And a lot more, the language of metaphysics is embedded in our culture too. Okay, the linguistic turn in philosophy even if the linguistic turn of philosophy has led us away from epistemology and metaphysics, it seems impossible to cut oneself off completely from the metaphysical logos. Is this the reason why the moral concern of pragmatism and hermeneutics today is to continue and promote the impulse to conversation of the West, rather than to ask metaphysical questions about what is or is not real? Is that what weak thought is all about? You could say that. So this is just explaining the question. We'll get into Rorty's answer, who answers first, next time. But basically, the moral concern of, let's say, pragmatic interpretation or hermeneutics is to encourage a conversation in the West about metaphysical questions rather than what is real and not real, like epistemology, what exists, what doesn't exist, does God exist, does God not exist, is there morality based on, like, what does God morally command us to do, that sort of shit. So I think that's interesting, like it's an interesting, like, less antagonistic approach to religion than it typically is, right? Because I totally agree that this idea that science and religion, or this idea between science and religion, is a false dichotomy. And as Rorty in particular, but both Rorty and Vattimo argue in this book, you can be a religious person and still completely accept science and look at them separately and have your own private religious life and respect science. So anyway, yeah, I think that's an interesting approach. So basically, it's really interesting. I would say that, so the message of this this paragraph in connection to the main thesis of the book, I would say, is that Nietzsche's death of God opened up the door for religion without a metaphysical God. However, even if in our modern Western culture, we can escape the notion of a metaphysical God, the language of God still remains embedded in our culture. So yes, according to Rorty and Vattimo, we no longer need the idea of a metaphysical God. And if you ask the question of whether God exists, who gives a shit? That's not important. What's important is what God means to you. And discussing with people about our interpretations and whether we can escape this religious language even in our secularized culture. So yes, according to Rorty and Vattimo, Nietzsche killed the metaphysical God, but you can never kill the language in our culture of God.